And as I'm looking at the site, I could see this low grassy mound just behind it. And it kept pulling my eye, and I kept thinking, God, that's very interesting. I wonder what that is. And I went home and I looked it up, and I saw that it was recorded that there was 2 tombs there that had been destroyed. And that just set me off. I get terrible when I've got a thread to pull at. I have to get to the end of it. I get really curious. I have to know. And that's got me into a lot of trouble in the past with getting stuck into projects that kind of never ended.
That was Neil Jackman, heritage consultant and archaeologist. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome to our 50th Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew. This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Ireland of the Welcomes magazine, celebrating 70 years of Irish history, tradition, culture, and community with outstanding photography and inspired writing. Get Ireland of the Welcomes delivered to your door or give a gift subscription and keep the Irish legacy alive for generations to come. Subscribe today online at irelandofthewelcomes.com. Welcome back to another serving of Irish Stew, actually our 50th serving. We're in episode number 50, and join us today as we dig deep into another global Irish story. Once I bring in my co-interrogator, the esteemed Martin Nutty.
Well, I try not to be an interrogator, but let's hope I'm a friendlier voice, John. But yeah, big day for us. 50th episode. A lot of podcasts actually don't get that far. As a matter of fact, most podcasts don't get beyond the 10th episode. So we're delighted to have everybody that listens to us kind of join in this celebration. And we're actually coming up on 2 years since we actually launched the podcast. But back to more important matters. I'm delighted to have Neil Jackman joining us today from Abarta Heritage. Neil is an archaeologist, a heritage consultant, an author, and a podcaster. And together with his wife, Róisín Burke, they're dual founders of Abarta Heritage, which we will discuss in more detail. And Neil is originally from the northwest of England. He's now a resident in Clonmel, and as I understand it, a newly minted Irishman. And with that, welcome, Neil. How is it to be an Irishman?
Oh, it's brilliant to be an Irish citizen, and it's even more brilliant to be joining you two guys today. So thanks very much, Martin and John, and congratulations on 50 episodes. That's a great achievement.
Thanks. Much appreciated, and we're delighted to have you on, Neil. And so we're going to kick this off. I understand you're the author of a hashtag, which is kind of interesting, actually, because our last episode featured a lady by the name of Margaret Malloy, who also invented or created an important hashtag. In her case, it was called Wearing Irish. And in your case, the hashtag you came up with is Know Your 5K, which I believe you, along with the National Museum of Ireland and the Irish Heritage Council, used to stimulate interest in matters historical. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. We came up with Know Your 5K. It was during the first kind of waves of COVID. And at that time, Ireland had a series of lockdowns where, especially in the earliest phases of it, were quite strict in that originally you weren't allowed to move beyond a 2K radius unless it was essential. And then that was expanded to 5 kilometers. And when I was kind of walking the dog and kind of, thinking about being stuck in a smaller radius than I'd be used to as somebody who is very lucky to spend half of the career going around the country looking at different monuments and all over the place, I started to think, well, in some ways I'm kind of spread 300 miles wide but only an inch deep. I'm getting to see lots and lots and lots of places, but I'm not really getting to see them in depth, in a sense. And I started to kind of wonder, are there ways to get people engaged with what's around their immediate area? How can you get them to see stuff that they walk past every single day? And, a good example of that happened to me. Like the route I normally walk the dog is past a place called Oíche Shamhna that's just outside of Clonmel, near the village of Marfield. And if you're walking there today, what you'll see is beautiful green fields that slope down to the river shore. And at the bottom of one of those green fields, there's a church, and it's a very ordinary looking church. It's about the 19th century. But in that field, we know that there was an important monastic site, a Cistercian monastery that was set up in the 12th century. And there's nothing at all to be seen in that field of that monastic site. It's completely disappeared. But as I was walking past, there's a long boundary wall just between you and the field, if you like, alongside the road. And as I'm walking along, the dog stops, and Peg, she's sniffing away at this particular bit, thinking about marking a territory. And I happened to stop and look down at the wall. And at the bottom of the wall, there was this large decorated stone, clearly medieval decoration. It was probably taken from a tomb, from a medieval tomb, sometime probably in the 18th or 19th century, when they were recycling bits of this ancient monastery and stuck into the side of the wall. So that was something I'd walked past 1,000 times and I'd never seen it. So I thought about, how do you help people to see? Because as you know, in Ireland, there's a story around pretty much every corner. So how do you help people to discover those stories for themselves? So we came up with guides, if you like, to all those free online resources like the Historic Environment Viewer, you know, and all of these different kind of resources. So people could then submit what they found or what interests them to a website, which is run by the National Museum, which is called ouririshheritage.org. And you had entries then from all over Ireland. And it was really wonderful to see the variety of sites that came in. It wasn't just archaeology. It wasn't just architecture. People were recording birdsong, for example, what the dawn chorus sounded like in their area and things like that. So it was a lovely kind of thing. And especially at a fairly bleak time, like those first lockdowns, it gave people, I think, or I hope it gave people, it certainly gave me, a new way of looking at everything that surrounds you. And it was really rewarding for that. You know?
And just to let our users know, Neil's archaeological-minded dog, I believe, is called Peg, and it's probably one of the cutest little pooches that I've actually seen.
She is, yeah. We call her the barchaeologist.
So what I'd like to do now is just kind of roll things back a bit. Obviously, Irish listeners will recognize your accent as being from the northwest of England. So tell us a little bit about the origin story. I believe you grew up in St. Helens. Where exactly is that for listeners that are not familiar with English geography?
Well, if they're familiar at all with Irish geography, if they drew a straight line from Dublin straight the way across to England, you'll pretty much hit St. Helens. We're right between Liverpool and Manchester, very working class industrial town. And when I was young, you know, in the kind of the early 80s, before, I won't get too political, but before Thatcher got rid of it all, England still had an industry, the town was famous for coal mines, for the glass industry. A lot of car windscreens and things like that were manufactured there. Beecham's, which is big pharmaceutical, you know, so it was a typical working class industrial town. And that was kind of the background I came from. But I was always interested in history and archaeology. I don't know whether it's one of the first films I ever remembered going to the cinema to see. I was about 6, which is way too young. But my granddad took me to see Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I was absolutely terrified all the way through it, but it definitely made an impression. I kind of blame it for ending up as an archaeologist. But yes, so I went to university in Wales, and a lot of my good friends at university were Irish. There was a really big Irish population in the university. And after that, you know, there wasn't too much work around where I was from. And I thought, I'd come over, I'd stayed with a couple of friends, and I got chatting to somebody, and they said there was a lot of work in County Clare. And I had the view that maybe I'd be there for a few weeks, see what it was like, and then go back to England and see what happens. But that few weeks turned into 23 years. I'm still here now, yeah. So it was a little bit of a roundabout, unexpected kind of way, but life happens like that, I suppose. Yeah.
Reminds me of my story of coming to New York. I stopped in New York for lunch on my way from Washington, D.C. to Connecticut, and I stayed. So it's like I stopped for lunch in like 1979, and I stayed all the way through. Neil, what in terms of archaeology, just to kind of help me set the picture, how old does something have to be archaeologicable? You know, where does the interest? Where is it just that you're digging around your backyard and you found something from 3 years ago, or where does the archaeology really begin?
Well, it's a really great question, John, and it's one that kind of a lot of people debate. And essentially, archaeology, we shouldn't get too much tied to a period as such. It's a process. Okay. So, for example, you would have forensic archaeologists working on murder cases now with the coroner and with the Gardaí. You know, so you'd be doing a lot of kind of very modern stuff in that case. So you'd have, you know, I know an awful lot of people who went to the Balkans during the wars there and were carrying war crimes excavations and things like that, looking at mass graves. So it can be extremely recent. And a lot of the projects that we've worked on in the last year or so have been looking at, say, the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War, you know, researching, documenting locations, safe houses, the bullet holes on the side of buildings. I know your previous guest, Damien, I blame him for getting us involved in this stuff, but it's really interesting, you know. So some of it can be really recent, you know, and then it goes back to the earliest evidence of human activity here in Ireland, which we used to think was the Mesolithic period, so around about 10,000 years ago, but recent evidence is pushing that a good bit further back. I haven't got all the data on that, can't talk too much about it, but we're certainly, you know, looking at that. So if you think of archaeology as a process, you're using archaeological techniques, which is based on physical evidence, it's based on context, and it's based on that kind of understanding of the physical remains of human activity. And that's what archaeology is. So it's not necessarily medieval is now archaeology and everything after that isn't. It's more about the process that we look at things.
So just for our listeners and for me, what exactly is the Mesolithic?
Yeah, so the Mesolithic period, that's the time of hunter-gatherers here in Ireland. So this is where you have quite a small population in the country. They're moving in small tribes. They're not necessarily, they only have stone tools and organic materials like wood and bone and things like that. It's before metal. And you're looking at a period that lasts from, in Ireland, really, roughly about 10,000 years ago. So it could be 8,000 BC up to about 4,000 BC. And the people that come after them, what we call the Neolithic period, they're people that come in from the outside, and they're people who bring with them farming, essentially. And that's where you find things like Newgrange and Carrickeel and all of these kind of big famous sites. So it's the period before that. There were settlements like Mount Sandal, but they tend to be seasonal. So these are small groups moving across the landscape. But there's a lot of research ongoing at that at the moment. And Professor Graham Warren at UCD has just brought out a fantastic book called Hunter-Gatherer Island, which is really challenging some of these impressions that we have of some of our first Irish men and women, if you like. Yeah.
How did they get here? How did they get to Ireland, Neil? Was the geography very different? Were there land bridges, or was it that they knew how to create boats or some early kind of?
It's a really good question, John. Largely travel by sea. We tend to think in a strange way, we think of the sea as a barrier now, and it was actually a routeway. It was the highway, essentially. And, it's quite remarkable, talking to somebody like Graham, when you realize that things like wild boar, for example, were brought into Ireland by these people. The red deer, which as such a symbol of wild Ireland, if you like, they came in thousands of years after the Mesolithic period, but the Neolithic people brought them in. So these are people who are well able to move across the landscapes. And you've got this story, I suppose, of people living in Western Europe, whether it's Britain, parts of France, the Iberian Peninsula, and you've got a movement and a conduit and a sharing of ideas, sharing of locations. Ireland was one of, I suppose, the last countries in that pocket to be completely free of ice. So it doesn't seem to have at this stage quite as long hominid identity. So we haven't found evidence of Neanderthal, for example, in Ireland. But right now there's some interesting work that's going on, which is beginning to cast hints from finds in Irish caves that there could have been people before the Mesolithic in Ireland, going back maybe 14,000 years, maybe 15,000 years, maybe much, much further. But the evidence is very, very small, very, very slight. And when you're looking at things that are that old, you're trying to piece things together. But some of the new techniques that can be done now with scientific analysis of remains, looking at bones, looking at things like isotopic analysis, that's where they look at the teeth, for example. And it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's a really interesting one because it's a great tool in archaeology now that, say if I died and in 1,000 years somebody found me and I'd been buried in an Aran jumper, I had an Irish flag draped around me, I had everything in there, was 100% Irish, right? And it had miraculously all preserved. The archaeologists could still tell where I grew up in the northwest of England by looking at the isotopic analysis, because what that comes from is as your teeth are forming, as the enamel forms on your teeth, you're drinking the local water, for example, that has a particular isotopic value that's related to the geology of the area that you grew up in. And that's fixed forevermore in your bones. It's fixed forevermore in your teeth in particular. So we can see things like movement of animals and movement of people now in much better resolution than we've ever been able to do it before. And combining that with things like ancient DNA and combining that with looking then at the archaeology, what kind of artifacts, what kind of cultural information can we have? We're beginning to get a much better sense of people living in Ireland in the past and just how complicated things like identity are, for example, and that sort of thing. So it's an interesting string to pull at, I suppose. So, sorry, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think,
I got a flash forward from the Mesolithic up till modern day. And as you mentioned, we had a colleague of yours, Damien Shields, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, and also another former colleague, I believe, Finn Dwyer, also you've worked with. Both have backgrounds in archaeology. And as I understand their story from the early 2000s, there was a lot of archaeology being done in Ireland, and then there wasn't. Was that also the case for you?
It was. Now, I have worked with Damien. I know Finn well, but I haven't had the pleasure of working with him. But no, their experience is very much the same as my experience as well. That when I started in 1999, it was just at the beginning of the boom. And then as the 2000s progressed, there was so many excavations because there was so much development. There was roads being developed. There was infrastructure like gas pipelines. There was large housing estates. There was large industrial estates springing up everywhere. So that amount, because of Ireland's laws, which is particularly strict about protecting archaeology and making sure that sites aren't just destroyed without being recorded, there was lots of opportunities to work. And then in 2008, of course, the crash happened, and the crash impacted the construction industry terribly. And as a result of that, archaeology was, for want of a better word, decimated. It went from thousands of archaeologists being employed to maybe 100, 200. It absolutely hollowed everything out. So, I was luckier than most at the beginning of that, in that I'd had the opportunity to work on and run some really interesting excavations. So, I'd come to kind of the end of, I'd just written a book and I'd just come to the end of that sort of thing. So I was kind of ready for a new chapter in a way. was a pretty brutal chapter to come along, but I was kind of in a nice position in that sort of sense. So I went to Australia briefly for a year, like a lot of Irish archaeologists did, and we went to survey, Aboriginal and traditional owner sites before mining areas were zoned and planned and things like that, to identify and say, look, this is an important site here. Put a buffer zone around it, to protect it and things. Then after that, I came back, and Ireland was it was in a similar condition. There wasn't the same opportunities in archaeology. And to be honest, I wasn't as interested in working in construction archaeology anymore. It's kind of, it is by its nature, and I'm glad it still happens, but it is by its nature is destructive. You're essentially watching lovely green fields being ploughed to turn into a motorway or what have you, and after a while, your ideas about that change a little. So when I came back, I was looking for another opportunity, and I ended up working as a tour guide actually at Trim Castle for the OPW. And it was during that process, and at this time as well, Róisín was working as a tour guide at the Rock of Cashel when I was over in Australia. So we both kind of had a very similar experience with that, where we both got really hooked on how do you tell the story of the past to the present? How do you engage people with it? And there's nothing like delivering lots of tours to people to get live feedback. You can see when they're getting bored and they're looking at the shoes or they're wandering off and all of that. Yeah.
I can see kind of a transformation there. It would seem to me like a lot of archaeology conversation would be kind of shop talk among archaeological professionals in a way that the common, the regular person really couldn't grab onto. But on your website, I see a lot of use of the word connection, connecting the public to the past. It's a different language and it's a different sensibility. It's not archaeology for its own sake. You're trying to bring people into the story.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much it. I was always a little frustrated in some ways that I felt archaeologists, we were okay at telling other archaeologists about the importance of what we were doing, But there was that step then to the broader public that I didn't feel was always being met. And I knew that there was a real interest and appetite for it. I mean, I grew up with things like Time Team, for example, which had a huge following in the UK, And anytime that you talk to somebody in the pub or something like that, and you say that you're an archaeologist, they're automatically, not everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people are automatically kind of interested. And they're like, oh yeah, I know this castle. I used to go play in there when I was a kid, or I'd know about this, or I'd know about that. And as a tour guide, you got that experience as well. You had people questions, you had people who were really wanting to kind of find out things. So I started to kind of look at ways of helping to bridge that. So I used to write a regular series of the journal.ie on sites, and that led me to a couple of guidebooks, writing one for the island's ancient East and one for the Wild Atlantic Way. So that whole thing about communicating with people, because to me, the past belongs to everybody. It doesn't belong to archaeologists. It doesn't belong to experts in this, that, and the other. It's our shared heritage, and I kind of feel it's very important that people have an understanding and an appreciation for it, because then they value it more. And if they value it more, there's more likely to be funding for conservation, for example, to keep these things for another generation. There's more opportunities then for people to help to tell the stories and to mediate the technical information with the general public. So I kind of feel like we've gotten much better at doing that in recent years. And it's a real, it's a real passion, I suppose, in a lot of ways to help to be part of that. Yeah.
So that interest manifested itself in the creation of Abarta, am I correct?
It did.
And that's an unusual name. So tell us about how the early stages of Abarta.
Yeah, well, we wanted to, I suppose, from Róisín's experience at the Rock of Cashel and my experience at Trim Castle, we were looking at this idea of how do you tell these big, complicated stories in an accessible way, because I remember giving the first tour at Trim Castle, those first poor people who were on the first tours with me, they were hearing everything about the Mortimer family and the de Lacys who'd first built it and all of the detail, and they wanted none of the detail, So it comes through a process, I suppose, of trying to refine down what's the essence of the stories of these places without dumbing anything down and without creating, while at the same time creating opportunities that people can dive deeper and always find extra resources if they want to go further. So with Abarta, when we started, we were originally looking at creating a series of audio guides, getting a professional narrator in and telling the story of places like Clonmacnoise and this, that, and the other. And we thought we'd try and retail those for $1.99 and people could download them onto their phones. Now, at that time, we knew nothing about marketing. We knew nothing about how the internet worked, and it worked and it didn't. And it was kind of hard to keep going. And all of a sudden I had the idea then of going, well, why don't we broaden that out a little bit? Why don't we make all of the audio guides and audiobooks free by working with different communities, working with different county councils and all of this, like the Rock of Dunamace, for example, in County Leitch, which is this beautiful wild ruin of a thing. It's like something out of a Tolkien story or something. And it's got this incredible history. So we created an audio guide for the county council for free, and people really kind of took to that. And that led us then to different ways of engaging with people. If we're not just going to do the audio, what else can we do? And that led us to a number of projects, all focused around this issue of connecting people to the past. How do you engage communities who are often the stewards of, our heritage sites and so on? How do you get them to interact or care about it, I suppose, in some ways? Sometimes that's pushing an open door and sometimes it isn't. How do you get them to look after a site in terms of best practice, for example? How do you get landowners on board and all of this kind of thing? So we've done lots and lots of different types of projects along those kind of ways. But it all essentially boils down to that thing of us trying to form a little bit of a bridge between the technical knowledge and, say, the legal aspects and the duty of care and all of this to the monuments, and then the general public on the other side. We can often span that bridge, in a sense, and help communities then work alongside groups like the Heritage Council or National Monuments and people like that to a good result for everybody. Yeah.
So I could see a real passion for community engagement. And I think one of the programs that you've been involved in is Adopt a Monument, which kind of lines up with what you were just saying. But can you fill us out or flesh that out for us a little more?
Sure. Adopt a Monument is a lovely scheme. It was started by the Heritage Council around about 2015, and it follows the model set up in Scotland. And the idea here is that community groups can apply to join this scheme. And when they join, so they might have a local, say, historic graveyard in the middle of the village. And in that historic graveyard, it might be overgrown. It might be kind of, you might have the ruin of a church, which is dilapidated and it's fallen into dangerous disrepair. And it's one of those kind of forgotten little things that everybody walks past every day. The gates kept locked. So how do we help to bring that from the periphery back into the heart of the community? And that's what Adopt a Monument seeks to do. So what happens is we have, at the moment, there's 20 groups all across Ireland, from Mallinhead to Baltimore in West Cork. And we work with it's the Heritage Council scheme, and we're the ones who provide the mentoring to all of the groups. So typically a community might join largely for one of three reasons. Firstly, they might have a site that they want to save. They don't want to be the generation that watches this old church or castle fall down. So how do they protect it, look after it, going through proper conservation steps and all the rest of it? So we can help with that. Another group might want to be looking at a site and they might want to increase tourism into their town. So how do they tell the story of their place in a way that is going to work for tourists and also work for the sustainability of the site? And then another type of group might be interested in how do they uncover the story of the place? They might be really curious about learning more about the localities. So they might be interested in doing things like surveys or even excavations in the case of one of the groups. And we help with that. And what we help with essentially is, as I say, we form this bridge where we understand what the legislation is. We understand what best practice is. So when a group is looking to do something, we can kind of advise and guide them that along the path of best practice. So they're always going to get kind of supports and collaboration rather than just a big, no, you can't do that, And we also identify funding. So this pot of money over here can help to cover that. Or this particular expert here is really good at this type of site. They've got lots of experience. So we kind of help with all of that. And then with the telling the story aspect as well, we give them training and the groups are very good at learning from each other too. There's a lot of shared experience, and it's an incredibly rewarding scheme because you'll see a group and they'll come in at the start of it and it can be very daunting. There's a lot of, even going for the funding, there's so much paperwork. There's such a long path to go. But to see groups like, say, for example, in Shamhna, which is in County Cavan, there was a group there, and much like that, they had a small historic church in a graveyard that was becoming overgrown. And the name itself, the Shamhna, came from the Church of the Rath. This was the Church of the Rath. This was the site that gave the village its name. And it had become largely forgotten. It was inside, you had a church that was built in the 17th century. It's the only Jacobean church in the Republic of Ireland. And the brick vaults of the roof were about to collapse. It had maybe 2-3 years, a couple of winter storms, it was gone, So we worked with them on this long process of looking for funding, looking for conservation. And now it's at the point where it's completely conserved. There's a new zinc protective roof over the part of the church that was about to collapse that looks really good. They did the first ever Heritage Week event there. And I had the idea, and they really went for it. It was brilliant, that all of the group should dress up as somebody buried in the churchyard from all of the different periods to tell the story. So you had somebody dressed up as an early medieval monk. You had somebody dressed up as like an 18th century rich landed, gentry. You had everybody in between. And people came in. I think on one of the days they got 400 people in, and most of them from the village, and most of them said, I've lived here all my life in Shamhna. I've never been into this churchyard before. So you're just looking for these different ways of giving people better memories of places so they feel more connected to it, they value it more, and that way it's the best form of protection that you can ever give any kind of monument, is that people love it and value it. And that's what we try to help with, I suppose, more than anything else.
Neil, another word I see a lot when I'm, looked at your website, and you've kind of referenced it a few times, is landscape. Connection to the landscape, connection to the place. And, it sort of brings up a lot of natural history topics to me. When I think of archaeology, my first image is broken pottery shards. But there's also the way the people interacted with the natural landscape, the way they changed it, what kind of animals or plants they used. It's a long kind of intro. I'm kind of thinking like, how can archaeology inform us today? There's a lot of interest in what the landscape should be like. What kind of, how are we managing our natural resources? Can archaeology help us understand the way it should be?
It's a great question, John. And one of the things I love best about archaeology, in a way, is that it's one of the broadest churches that you can get, in that at one end of it, it's almost a complete science. And that goes to things like isotopic analysis and things like that we were talking about before. And at the other end of it, it's almost pure art. And you're looking at things like reconstruction drawings or the audio books that we make or things like that, And at that science end of things, that could really help us a lot with understanding past landscapes, past ecologies, past kind of environments. But it can also give us little hints about what to expect in the future and how a changing climate that we have right at the moment, a really accelerated change in the climate, is going to affect our monuments. So in terms of understanding, there's things like paleo-environmental studies And that's where you can look at things, whether it's, the pollen in bog cores, which can show whether people were clearing woodland at particular phases or whether people were planting crops nearby and what those crops were. It can tell you an awful lot from these tiny microscopic bits of pollen that have been trapped in there. You can also see things like how people have adapted and used the landscape as well, from industrial things like creating mills and such to slightly more, I suppose if you look, for example, when you're driving around the Irish landscape now and you go, say, over the Connacht Pass down to the Dingle Peninsula, it's this raw, rugged terrain. That's probably only looked like that for certainly less than 1,000 years, maybe 700 or 800 years, because William Marshall in the medieval period industrialized essentially upland sheep farming in Ireland. He starts to create an industry in the medieval period around sheep farming, and we still have a lot of that today. That's what grazed most of those slopes all around the country and our hills and our mountains. So a lot of our landscape is shaped by people. It's one of the chief drivers of change, and archaeology can help you to understand some of those changes. And one of the projects we really liked being involved with, it was with in Fingal in North County Dublin. We did a citizen science project with a council there, where we helped the community and the participants to look at and monitor evidence of climate change on the monuments locally. So along the coast there, you can see where middens, which is where, as back as far as the Neolithic or even the Mesolithic in some instances, people were eating shells or collecting shellfish and discarding them. They create these things called middens, and they're being eroded by the sea, or you might see that lichen has started to grow over a particular high cross or something like that, which has never been done before. Or more obviously, in a lot of cases, that you can see damage from wind and, storm damage and things like that on monuments. And the participants that are monitoring now over a period of time all of the sites and the more vulnerable sites along the coast there. So it's a case, archaeology can help you to both understand how life has changed in the past, how people have changed our environment, changed the scope of our landscape, but it can also help us to understand what's going to come in the future as well. So it can be important for that. Yeah.
Neil, let's go in a different direction here for Irish Stew. We always like to get a sense of how people view an Irish identity. Martin's from Ireland. I'm an Irish American. We've talked to people from, really all over the world who have some different version of Irishness. We had a great conversation with a mystery novelist from Liverpool to give us a little sense of the Irish community and the Irish influence in that part of England. So maybe you can speak about your experience of being from England, from the Northwest, coming to Ireland. What's it like to trot that accent out when you're in various parts of Ireland? How are you perceived? You're an Irish citizen now. How Irish are you? Anything along those lines about perceptions of Irishness and what you saw when you came over?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And, sometimes change happens in such small increments that you don't realize until you look back and you realize how different you were, 10 or 20 years. You don't notice that change happening at the time. And it's funny because I grew up in a really Catholic family. And I'm not far from Liverpool. I'm from about 12 miles from Liverpool. Liverpool, of course, has such a big Irish diaspora. And my mother's mother, my mum's mother, her side of the family, I think, Fallons were, I think, come from kind of South Roscommon, Midlands thing. But, that Irish aspect, it was never really part of our upbringing, in a sense. It was just, we're from St. Helens kind of thing. So Catholicism, definitely. House is full of, holy pictures. Padre Pio was a big celebrity in our house. But we never really kind of discussed kind of Irishness in a sense. Now, I went to a De La Salle school, which again, you get in Ireland quite a lot. And in the class, it's full of O'Neills and O'Hagans and all of these kind of, so it is an Irish diaspora thing, but it was never really present in the same way that it would be in certain parts of Liverpool, let's say. But when I came over, you know, I can kind of remember, like, you know, it was all fairly new to me and stuff, and I treated it fairly lightly, I suppose. There was a good cohort of other, because at the start it was such a boom. There was archaeologists, a big cohort from Sweden, there was a lot from England, there was a lot from Scotland, you know, different places. So it was a real melting pot kind of thing. But it was over time, and I think it was Australia, strangely enough, that made me more Irish, you know, because I was out there for a year and I was working out in some of the most remote places. And one of the jobs, for example, I was based in Perth, where we were kind of off duty, if you like. And then we drove out to a job and we drove for 16 hours. And the landscape didn't change once in 16 hours. Now, I could do about 4 laps of Ireland in that time. And I'm seeing bogs, mountains, coasts, you know, cities. You know, you're seeing such a range of landscapes and such a range of different types of stories written on them. And it wasn't that I was disinterested in Australia. I was very interested in work. But I just kept feeling this pull, this gravity to get back. And it's funny, you know, since then, and certainly when I was doing things like working on the guidebooks, and what a privilege that was, that, you know, doing the Wild Atlantic Way one, driving every nook and cranny all along the coast, you just get to see such a range of things. And you have to keep pinching yourself going, this is incredible. You know, these stories, these places, these sites, just something else. And every one of them is laden with its own particular story and its own particular personalities and families and characters and communities. And as you immerse yourself in that, it's impossible not to become subsumed in some way. So, yeah, so one of the great joys, I suppose, it was actually, again, just before, it was March 2020. So it was just before the first lockdowns. It was like the last big public event. They put myself and 900 other people got their Irish citizenship. And that was something I'd thought about for a long time before. And I'd even thought of it kind of, you know, I suppose Brexit in some ways was a bit of a catalyst, you know, but I was thinking about it prior to that as well. But yeah, I got that, and it was one of the warmest welcomes you could ever get. It's an absolutely lovely thing to go through. And has it changed things? A little, I suppose. I mean, I've got 2 kids now. One of them's just started in the Gaelic. You know, one of them is called Cuan, and the other one is called Donica. These are both really old names from Munster. It's partially to kind of put the pressure on my family and learning how to use fodders and things like that to pay them back for voting for Brexit. But, you know, at the same time, I do feel, you know, I'm not Irish as such, but I am an Irish citizen. And, you know, I could never see myself, I think, living anywhere else for that. I just think the character of the place, the wealth of heritage around every single corner, the interesting stories, you could never get bored. You could never see it all, you know. And just this year marks the tipping point where I've lived more of my life in Ireland than I have in England. So it's, I don't know, I suppose that's kind of where I'm at now. So I'm extremely fond of the place. As you can see, I can talk until I'm blue in the face. Every time I go elsewhere, I'm kind of just hungry to get back to Ireland, you know. And in recent years, I couldn't even imagine going on holiday anywhere other than, say, Donegal or the Burren or Kerry or something like that, you know. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it, right? Yeah.
Speaking of places, let's talk about a couple of places that you've been involved in, both professionally and places of interest to you.
Yeah.
I'm going to start out with a place called Montpelier Hill, which is just south of Dublin, which also goes by another more famous name. So talk to me about your involvement in that place.
Well, it's a very appropriate place to talk about. We're here in October, coming up to Halloween, and the Montpelier Hill is more famously known as the Hellfire Club. And it's also appropriate because in 2016, we did an excavation there for the month of October, which ran the whole month, finishing at Halloween. So it's a site, I think, that at the time, I first got interested in it. At the time, I was writing a series of articles for the journal.ie on trying to encourage people to go out looking at heritage sites. And I was doing a Halloween special. And as I was walking around the Hellfire Club, it's one of those places that, there's lots of ghost stories about this, that, and the other kind of, paranormal, yada, yada stuff. And that's fine. I love a bit of folklore and stuff, but some of it seemed a bit much. But I went up to have a look. And as I'm looking at the site, I could see this low grassy mound just behind it. And it kept pulling my eye, and I kept thinking, God, that's very interesting. I wonder what that is. And I went home and I looked it up, and I saw that it was recorded that there was 2 tombs there that had been destroyed. And that just set me off. I get terrible when I've got a thread to pull at. I have to get to the end of it. I get really curious. I have to know. And that's got me into a lot of trouble in the past with getting stuck into projects, that kind of never ended. But in this particular case, I carried out research, and the story of the place, it's this low hill. It's just at the start of the Dublin Mountains, but it's only 340 metres above sea level. It's more of one of the foothills of the Wicklow Mountains, really. It's just outside of Tala, near Rathfarnham in South County Dublin. And it kind of, when you're in the city, it's one of those dark mountains that just kind of frame that view southwards when you're looking out. So I started to do the research, and I saw that there was a story that the Speaker of the Irish Parliament, a man called William Connolly, he was the richest man in Britain or Ireland at the time, hugely wealthy. He started out as an innkeeper from Ballyshannon in Donegal. He was the son of an innkeeper, and he made himself incredibly wealthy during land transfers, after the Williamite Wars at the end of the 17th century. So the newly crowned King William granted one of his followers from Holland a couple of thousand acres in Ireland. He had no interest in it. William Connolly would take his off his hands for a knockdown price and either sell it on at a profit or keep it for himself. So he got to be incredibly wealthy, and he decided that he was going to build his great mansion at Castletown House near Selbridge in County Kildare. Beautiful site, still fabulous to go and see today, in great condition. And up on top of this hill, Montpelier Hill, he was going to build his hunting lodge. And to build his hunting lodge, he demolished 2 prehistoric tombs. Large, it didn't give too much of a description. It called them cairns at the time. So all that was left when you go up there is this ugly grey building, very foreboding looking. It would have been plastered and whitewashed at the time. It would have been very fancy looking. But behind it, you had just this little low mound. And he died shortly after it was built, which adds to the folklore of the Hellfire Club, that the devil was incredibly angry that this tomb got desecrated. So first he blew the roof off the Hellfire Club. Connolly had the roof built again in stone. That gives it this really odd appearance. And then Connolly himself died shortly afterwards. And it got connected to a group of aristocrats who called themselves the Hellfire Club. And they were some of the richest men in Ireland at the time, incredibly powerful people like, Parsons, Richard Parsons, who's the Earl of Ross, Henry Barry, who's Lord Santry. These were the creme de la creme of aristocracy. They hard drinkers, worse partiers, incredibly violent. One of them, Henry Barry, inculpated in 2 murders. One of them he stood trial for and was found guilty. So these guys, there's a lot of stories about them doing black masses up there and this, that, and the other. So how could you not be interested in a place with that level of storage, So what we wanted to do, we did the Hellfire Club Archaeological Project. So we started with a series of surveys. And then in 2016, we carried out an excavation. And the question was there, firstly, could we tell what that mound was? Was it, in fact, a prehistoric tomb? If it was a prehistoric tomb, what did it date to? What type of tomb was it? Can we tell anything about it? Or essentially, was it just the remains of a quarry pit from the 18th century when they demolished everything? So we carried out the excavation in October. We had about 500 people come and visit us every single day. It was madness up on top of the hill there. Somebody left a Bible in the middle of the trench because they were convinced that we were going to unleash a curse. And, since 2016, the world has been a bit different. So, maybe we did. Who knows? But we found a polished stone axe. We found megalithic art, like you would see at Knowth or Newgrange. We managed to prove that it was a Neolithic tomb, probably a passage tomb. It was an incredible experience to be a part of that. And we still have good hopes to go back up and do another little phase up there for sure. But I think that's one of the good examples of a place that people would go every single day, and they still go there partying, which is fine because that's what it was built for, I suppose. But they never knew the whole story about the place. We just wanted to do a little bit more. So we did loads of school tours and loads of engagement like that. And it was brilliant for it. And I think, archaeology has that, I suppose, potential to engage people, and that people wanted to come up, and it wasn't so much finding out about the Neolithic tomb that they were interested in. They wanted to see the process of archaeology, how we go about doing it, how we go about carrying out an excavation. There was a lot of interest in that too. So it was a lot of fun for sure.
Is there any opportunity to, do something there for Halloween, to kind of shine a spotlight on it in that way?
Yeah, they have ghost tours there. There's people doing a ghost bus, and there's people doing haunted tours, and there's a whole paranormal group and that. And I kind of stay out of that stuff a little bit. Like, it's, it has its place. It's fine. And it's fun. Yeah. And, they've got good reason to do it. There's a lot of crazy stories about that place. But I leave people to it a little with that, but it is a
I've got basically one more question, Neil, and it kind of moves you into a part of Ireland you like very, very much. Mm-hmm. But it's, I saw on your website, there's a site there that you consider your favorite archaeological site. Mm-hmm. But on that site is something that you say you are even more passionate about than archaeology.
Yeah.
Tell us about the puffins.
Yeah, Skellig Michael and the puffins. Yeah, I'd love to say it was the first time I went. I've been there 3 times now. This year was the first time that we actually couldn't get out there because of the swell was too high.
And the place is?
Skellig Michael.
Right.
So it's the small island. It's off the coast of County Kerry. You have to take a small boat to it. It takes about 50 minutes crossing the Atlantic. People, if you're not familiar with it, if you've seen the recent Star Wars films, it had the starring role of the Star Wars films, It's this incredible little island, and on top of it, there's a small monastery. Along with that monastery, which has roots going back to kind of the 7th century, and then activity there in the 8th and 9th. So you have clacons, which are these small beehive huts. You have the enclosures. You have a number of other features there. And of course, the famous steps, the 618 stone steps left by the monks that you still walk up. And it's a little bit terrifying if you're afraid of heights, and, but the reason I really love it is because it's home to about 7,000 puffins. And puffins, for me, people look at them and they think they can't. Now, this is dangerous because I could talk for about a week on puffins, but I'll try and capture it in a nutshell about why I love them so much. People look at them and they kind of look slightly clownish. They've got the big colourful beaks and they've got the funny little walk. They look like waiters almost in the black and white. But those birds are just, for a start, they've got one of the lowest divorce rates in the animal kingdom. It's something like 97% partnered for life kind of thing. And they can live up to about 30 or 40 as well. And at the end of every single year, what a lot of people don't know is that they head out in separate directions. They don't stay together, the partners. Maybe that's why they've got such a low divorce rate. They spend half the year apart. Who knows? Sorry, Róisín, if she's listening. But they head out into the Atlantic, or they head out almost off the coast of Canada. The bright orange beaks turn a dull grey. The feet turn grey. So they're these nondescript little birds, and they spend the whole winter out in the open ocean. It's a really kind of harsh life they have. But then they come back every year to the same burrow that they left. I think it's kind of astonishing. They're very hardy, very tough little characters. but they're the most charming and beautiful things. And if you're there, the last time we landed on the island was 2019, I think, and it was very misty. So there was no view out, and the views out from Skellig Michael are breathtaking. You're looking out across the Atlantic. You can see Ireland in the distance. You can see little Skellig below with its Gaelic colonies. But because it was so misty, there was no view. But all the puffins were home, and they're all just kind of gathered everywhere. You almost have to kind of slightly nudge them with your feet as you're trying to go up these treacherous steps. They're all just sitting in the middle of the steps. They basically land on you, kind of thing. They're that close. They're just everywhere. It's marvelous. Yeah. Sorry, I could talk a lot about puffins. I'll cut back.
Episode 2, the puffins.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it sounds almost like a Galapagos type experience. The irony, of course, is I've been to the Galapagos, but I've never been to Skellig Michael, which is something that I have to do at some point in time.
It's marvelous, but it's difficult, because the weather conditions are so treacherous out there. Like I say, I've been very lucky. I've tried 4 times and landed 3 times. A good friend of mine has tried 9 times and only landed 3. So a lot of the times it's cancelled because of that. And
if you're going to visit, you have to be patient.
Yes,
and persistent.
Yeah, exactly. I'd stay a little bit longer around that part of Kerry. I think I'd just kind of try and fit it into that. So if you get rescheduled, it's no problem to you. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we're getting to that point in time where we have to trot out our mascot known as Seamus Plug. And Seamus is your opportunity to tout something that you're passionate about or involved in or tell our listeners about. So what would you like to include in our Seamus Plug?
Oh, God. Well, I have a few things. I'll try and keep it short. So if people like podcasts and they want to know a bit more about archaeology, we have Amplify Archaeology Podcast, which is me interviewing a lot of experts who are dealing with either whether it's particular excavation or whether it's looking at a whole period or Irish castles or Irish high crosses. You're hearing the leading experts kind of chatting about them, and it's a great privilege to be able to talk to people about them. So I'd love it if people would give that a listen. And we started something new, actually, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about helping people to discover everything that's around them. And we started something called Tour, which is Tuatha. And that is essentially, it's a membership website where you join and there's loads of articles about places to go and visit with the story of the place and practical information. You get itineraries for places like the Dingle Peninsula or the Ring of Kerry is one we're just working on right now, or up around Malin Head and things like that. And there's online courses in Irish archaeology, or we have webinars with experts then. We just had Dr. Gillian Kenny talking about Gráinne Whale, for example, and such. So we try to, I suppose, it really suit people who are either looking to come to Ireland for a holiday and they want to make sure that they're going to see all the hidden gems and they're not just going to try and tick off, the big names. They're going to be able to dwell a little longer and get a bit deeper into some of the stories. Or it's for people who maybe can't travel to Ireland, but they feel a really strong connection with it and they want to see some of these Irish landscapes. We have these immersive videos where you can just watch the sunset at the Clogher Strand and things like that, So hopefully it's something that people enjoy for that kind of thing, But it's all about trying to, I suppose, in a sense, create those connections between people and place, which is really rewarding right here in Ireland. So if people would check out tour.ie, I'd be really grateful for that.
I'm delighted to be a member of tour.ie. Tour, as some of our listeners no doubt know, is the Gaelic for country. It's spelled Tuath, although it's pronounced like the TH is dropped, Tua. And there's lots of good material. I'm particularly passionate about the idea of plunking oneself down in a locale and understanding it on a more micro level, which kind of affords the opportunity of getting out of the car and spending more time on the ground. And I believe personally that is the best way to kind of come to terms or an understanding of a country that you visit. And really get to grips with it in a whole different way. But with that, on behalf of John and myself and our listeners, I want to thank you, Neil Jackman, for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend with us. It's been enlightening, and hope to have the opportunity to engage again as you continue to expand all your offerings. I think Ireland presents enormous opportunities to enjoy now because of your work and the work of many other groups that are involved there. There's a cultural density and richness in Ireland that is only just beginning to be exposed now that the country at least has a little bit more wealth. So again, thank you. Really enjoy this conversation.
It's been great talking to you both. And again, congratulations and keep up the great work. It's some brilliant conversations that you've had with past guests. So I was delighted to be a part of this. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Neil.
That was Rosa Nutty, the Irish Stew podcast songstress, and the excerpt of the song you're listening to is Wildcard, taken from her new album, World Still Blue. To hear the song, stick around right till the end of the episode, and you'll hear the whole track.
Well, Martin, before we get into our recap of that episode with Neil Jackman, it's our call to action. And Martin, this call to action is for us, the two of us, because we're at 50 episodes right now, and we are really overdue to thank the people who listen. It's so great to know that there are people really, I don't want to exaggerate, but around the globe who are tuning in and listening to these stories. Obviously, we couldn't do it without you, and we are overdue to say thank you.
Yeah, obviously, I'm going to second that. It's humbling when people reach out to me and say how much they enjoyed an episode, bringing voices maybe that are not heard so often. And I'm guessing you're not going to turn on your TV and see Neil Jackman every day of the week. He's a very well-known guy in the area of archaeology and heritage in Ireland. But you're not going to get an hour of audio where he tells you his story and tells you about his particular passions. I think it was a special opportunity, being a history nerd, for me to spend some time with Neil. And one of the most important things I think that came across in this episode is the emphasis that Neil places on grappling with your immediate locale, your immediate place, and engaging with that on all aspects of heritage. So really enjoyed that episode, and hope you did too, John.
Yeah, there's a lot of connections. I think we always find it, Martin, with other episodes we've had. You brought up Margaret Malloy and the hashtag movement she started, and his hashtag Know Your 5K. I know we didn't really get into it, but branding was an important part of what he does. Maybe that'll be for episode 2. And I saw the connection with the Jack Byrne episode. Jack Byrne, the mystery writer from Liverpool, who talked about, despite there was such a large Irish diaspora population, it wasn't the Irish culture. They were in the Catholic culture, which Neil also touched on. And he's just he said, about a dozen miles from where Jack grew up. So I appreciated all that sense of connection to the land, connection to the people, connecting the people to their heritage. A great way to look at archaeology and a great indication of the kind of work that Neil is doing.
Absolutely.
Yes, I'll perk up. Tell me a joke.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.